Yes, you there. Did you know that Indigenous people are 2% behind non-Indigenous people in recovering their employment rate since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic? No, you say. Well, you're in luck, because this video is exactly about that subject, and we will be diving into that. But before we get into the specifics, let me give you a general idea of this issue. Even before the mandated quarantine, in 2019, there was already a disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups in Canada and their employment rates. So, Indigenous people had a 58.8% employment rate, whilst there was a 62.9% employment rate amongst other Canadians. In May 2020, the two groups were now at 50.7 and 54.2% respectively. This decrease makes sense as during the pandemic there were a lot of places that had to shut down, and there was obviously an uptick of unemployment. In August 2020, employment was already picking up again as Canada was gradually opening things up again. Indigenous people were now at 51.9%, while non-Indigenous people were at 58% employment. In August 2020, employment was already picking up again in Canada as things were opening up. Indigenous people were now at 51.9%, while their non-Indigenous counterparts were at 58%. Now, Aboriginal peoples were now 6.9% off of their 2019 statistic, while non-Indigenous groups were only 4.9% off. Now you can see where that 2% came from. 2% might not seem a lot in the grand scheme of things, but when you think about that, that's roughly 33,000 Indigenous people who were employed at the start of the pandemic and no longer are. They still haven't recovered or gotten a new job yet, and that is 5 months after the beginning of this pandemic already. Now the question begs itself, why is there a disparity between these two groups, and why is there also a difference between their recovery times? Well, the short answer is that there isn't one specific clear-cut reason why Indigenous people have to recover slower or aren't as don't even have as high of an employment rate. It is more that there is a multitude of reasons and factors that combine together for there to be this difference. A few examples that could be stumbling blocks for these people would be prejudice against Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people, poor housing on reserves, and literacy rates in these communities. But let's focus on literacy rates first. According to a study conducted by Statistics Canada, 35% of off-reserve First Nations and 50% of off-reserve Métis had a literacy score of level 3 or higher. In parallel, 50% of non-Indigenous people have a sufficient literacy score. They also found that only 58% of young adults on reserve had finished high school, while having a high school diploma is something looked for when hiring. Meanwhile, 54% of Canadians either have college or university level qualifications, which is basically the same number, except that's the number of people who have even a higher education. So what can we do about it? As teenagers, we cannot change legislation or vote for different people, but we can start with ourselves and our entourage. We can learn and educate ourselves first. If you know someone who identifies as Indigenous, you can ask them questions if they are willing to answer. Seeing these people as individuals, learning to sympathize with them, and knowing that there is always more that we can learn is the first step we have to make. The more we listen and learn from people who have different experiences than us, the more we are able to keep these things in mind in our everyday lives. Telling those who surround us about these issues helps in humanizing these groups who are often discriminated against for problems that cannot simply be blamed on laziness or unwillingness to try or any other generalizing offensive assumption. A survey published in 2016 says that 75% of Canadians pay some attention to the news when they're talking about Indigenous issues. Those who, in 2009, which was 12%, said that they pay a lot of attention, have now increased to 22% of Canadians who pay a lot of attention to the news. And since there is an increase, there's also an increase of people who want something to be done about these issues. So even if we're not old enough yet, one day we'll be able to be part of that 22% and increase change in these communities. Now, how do we apply this, you ask? Well, often, to start a conversation, all you have to do is say something or ask a question, and the rest flows much easier. Observe a natural conversation started by Dave. Hey Hannah, could you tell me about insert random Indigenous issue here that isn't unemployment rates? Well, Dave, I couldn't tell you that because I didn't research that much further, but here are some resources and some people who know much better than me and are much well versed on the subject. Some of my friends might have even made a rant on this subject. Wow, Thank you, Hannah. I feel much more informed now. My pleasure. Thank you, Dave, for that demonstration. Now, how hard was that? With that being said, I hope that this has taught you something new on unemployment rates in Indigenous communities. I hope that it also prompts you to do your own further research on this topic and other Indigenous issues. This will help you understand that these people are individuals with their own stories, and that the subject matter is not as black and white as some might assume. This has been my rant, and I'm signing out.